I was halfway through staining the cedar porch beams when I heard the tires crunching up the gravel path. No one ever came out here unless they were lost or looking for a fight. I wiped my hands on a rag and turned to see a bright white Lexus SUV rolling to a stop just beyond the split-rail fence. The door swung open and out stepped a woman with a platinum bob, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. I already knew her type. "Excuse me," she called out, striding like she owned the forest. "Are you the property owner here?" I leaned against the post, arms crossed. "Yeah, name's Grady Dalton. Can I help you?" Her nostrils flared like I just insulted her mom. "Helen Langford. I'm the president of the Pinebrook Meadows HOA." I raised an eyebrow. "This land isn't part of Pinebrook Meadows. It never has been." She smiled like a cat who'd cornered a mouse. "Actually, Mr. Dalton, that's what I'm here about. According to our records, this parcel was originally tied to the HOA when it was formed in 1965. That means you owe nearly 60 years in unpaid dues." I blinked. "You've got to be kidding. This was my grandfather's hunting cabin. He built it before Pinebrook even existed. When he passed, it sat unused for decades until I started fixing it up last fall. There's no HOA here." "Never was." Helen clicked her pen. "You rebuilt the structure. That constitutes property development under our covenant. The land may not have a house on record, but the association has jurisdiction over all adjacent parcels lying within 200 feet of the original boundary map, which this is." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe the audacity. "You're reaching." She pointed to the cabin. "You've got new siding, poured concrete footings," and she glanced at her clipboard, a solar array. "That's not maintenance. That's improvement. I'll be sending you a dues invoice and a notice of violation." "No, you won't," I said. "This property is outside your jurisdiction. I checked county records before I even cleared the first log. There's a natural creek that separates this land from Pinebrook. That's the boundary. Always has been." She pursed her lips. "County records can be wrong. Not when they're confirmed by a land surveyor, a title company, and the zoning office." Helen paused, thrown off for just a second. Then she regrouped. "Well, we'll see what our legal team has to say." "Please do," I said. "And while you're at it, tell them to stop trespassing. You're on private land." She turned without another word, marching back to her SUV like she'd just lost a game she didn't know she was playing. The moment her tires disappeared down the hill, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder labeled HOA Nonsense. I'd been recording the entire conversation. I didn't trust HOAs, especially ones run by folks like Helen Langford, people who got high on rules and control. My grandfather used to say, "They'll try to steal your land with a smile and a clipboard." I never understood what he meant until that afternoon. I went back to staining the beams. But now I wasn't just rebuilding a cabin, I was preparing for war. HOA story, HOS stories, Homeowners Association stories. The next time I saw Helen Langford, she wasn't alone. It was 3 days later, just after sunrise, and I was unloading reclaimed barn wood from the back of my truck. Mist still clung to the treetops, and the creek babbled on like it had every morning since I was a boy. I heard tires again, but this time it was 2 vehicles, her Lexus and a gray SUV with tinted windows and a county plate. Out stepped a man in a charcoal suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He adjusted a leather case under his arm and glanced around like he couldn't figure out why he was standing in a forest. Helen followed behind him, wearing a tailored red blazer and heels that immediately sank into the soft dirt. "You're trespassing again," I said without turning. The man cleared his throat. "Mr. Dalton, I'm Alan Dorsey. I'm here on behalf of the Pinebrook Meadows Homeowners Association. I've been retained by Miss Langford to initiate a boundary clarification and dues enforcement action." Helen looked way too pleased with herself. I nodded slowly. "You an attorney or just pretending?" He hesitated. "I'm a legal consultant. Not currently licensed in this county, but I've worked with several associations across the state." So, not a lawyer, he shifted. I've been authorized to serve you with this packet. It outlines the HOA's claim to the land and notifies you of delinquent dues, architectural violations, and a lien pending against your property. I took the envelope, opened it, and scanned the top page. There's a problem, I said. This parcel's not under any HOA. I've got a certified plat map, tax records, and a signed letter from the county zoning director saying as much. Your claim has no legal standing. Helen stepped forward. That's your interpretation. Our documents show that the original developer filed a preliminary map in the 60s that included this area. It was never formally removed from the HOA's scope. I set the packet down on a stump. You're trying to rewrite history. That map was never finalized. The developer abandoned the expansion because of the creek. The county has no record of any annexation. Alan adjusted his glasses. Then I suppose this will have to be settled in civil court. I leaned against the truck bed. Fine by me. But if you file a lien based on fraudulent jurisdiction, that's a violation of state law, and if you trespass again, I'll have no choice but to involve the sheriff. Helen's eyes narrowed. You don't scare me with empty threats. Good, I said, because I'm not threatening. I'm documenting. I pointed to the pine tree about 10 feet away where a trail camera blinked silently. Another one was mounted under the eaves of the cabin. I'd upgraded the system after our last meeting motion activated, night vision, high resolution with cloud backup. Helen's expression changed ever so slightly. Alan looked like he suddenly regretted his morning. Without another word, they left the envelope on the stump and retreated to their vehicles. I watched them drive off, then took the envelope inside. I wasn't going to ignore it. I was going to use it. That night, I drove into town and met with someone I hadn't seen in years. Her name was Claire Redmond, a land use attorney who'd grown up in the next county over. We'd gone to high school together, and she'd once punched a vice principal for suspending her brother without cause. I figured that kind of energy might come in handy. She flipped through the documents with a frown. This is nonsense. They're citing a draft plan that was never adopted. There's no legal basis here. They're threatening to lien the property. She tapped the last page. That's the part that matters. Filing a false lien is a Class E felony in this state. If they actually follow through, we can press charges. I nodded. I want to be ready. You've got everything documented: video, timestamps, survey records, title history, chain of ownership. Even the original developer's letter from 1971 saying the expansion was abandoned. She grinned. Then let them try. Over the next week, I didn't hear a peep from Helen, but I stayed busy. I installed 2 more cameras, updated the alarm system, and filed a preliminary complaint with the county registrar's office. Claire helped me draft a cease and desist letter, which I mailed certified, return receipt requested. Then came the real twist. On a Thursday morning, a crew of landscapers showed up at the edge of the property line. 4 men in green polos started measuring along the tree line, placing orange flags in the soil. I walked up calmly. "Can I help you fellas with something?" One of them looked uncomfortable. We were hired to begin clearing brush for a boundary fence. Got a work order from the Pinebrook Meadows HOA. I pointed at the creek. That's the boundary. You're on private land. If you move 1 shovel of dirt, I'll call the sheriff. They didn't argue, packed up and left within 10 minutes. That afternoon, I drove down to the county recorder's office to check if Helen had filed anything shady. The clerk, a wiry guy named Vince with a voice like gravel, met me at the counter. "Got something weird this morning," he said when I explained who I was. An HOA tried to register a retroactive annexation map, said it was from 1965 but had a digital timestamp from 2 weeks ago. I flagged it for review. My jaw clenched. They forged a historical document. Looks that way. I already reported it to the county legal team. If they push it, we'll refer it to the DA. I thanked him and left with a copy of the forged map in hand. Helen hadn't just been bluffing, she was actively trying to fabricate history. That night, Claire and I put together a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office. We included copies of everything surveys, original boundary maps, the video footage, and the altered document from the recorder's office. The next morning, I received a voicemail from Detective Wade Harlan, a property crimes investigator with the county sheriff's department. I called him back immediately. "We've opened an investigation," he said. "The document submitted by the HOA president constitutes attempted fraud. We'll be conducting interviews next week." I stood in the cabin's doorway, the morning light cutting across the floorboards I'd laid by hand. If they're willing to fake maps, what else have they been doing? That's what we intend to find out. By the end of the week, Helen's name was on a county fraud investigation list. The sheriff's office had served a warrant for the HOA's internal records. Her vice president, a nervous man named Gary Rourke, folded under questioning and turned over emails showing Helen had instructed the board to create a paper trail justifying the annexation. Turns out, she'd even tried to backdate meeting minutes to make it appear as though the board had voted on the land grab months earlier. But the metadata on the files told a different story. Everything had been typed up less than 2 weeks ago. Detective Harlan called me again. "We're preparing charges, falsifying public records, attempted fraud, and unlawful lien threats. We've also notified the state bar she's not a lawyer, but she's been giving legal instructions under the table." I exhaled long and slow. "So what happens next? She'll be arrested." "The HOA may face civil penalties too. We've already warned them to suspend all enforcement actions until the investigation is complete." That night, I stood on the porch, listening to the creek. The land felt quieter now, like it had exhaled along with me. The lights from the solar array cast a soft glow across the clearing. I wasn't naive enough to think it was over, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like the ground I stood on was truly mine. Claire called just before midnight. "You might want to check tomorrow's paper." "Word is they're running a front-page story." I smiled into the phone. "Good. Maybe next time someone tries to steal land with a clipboard, they'll think twice." And behind me, the cabin stood tall, rebuilt, rooted, and no longer alone. 3 days after the county launched its investigation, I got a knock on the cabin door just before dusk. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the only people who ever came out this far without calling were the kind that didn't belong here. I opened the door slowly, hand near the latch. A man in a forest green windbreaker stood on the porch, holding a leather-bound notepad and flashing a badge. "Grady Dalton?" he asked. "That's me." "Detective Ellie Monroe, State Bureau of Investigation. Do you have a moment?" I nodded and stepped aside. He walked in with the kind of calm you don't fake. His eyes scanned the interior, stopping briefly on the map of the property I'd pinned on the wall. "I need to ask you a few questions about Pinebrook Meadows," he said, flipping open his notepad. "Specifically about something deeper than a forged map." I motioned to the small table near the fireplace. "Go ahead." He sat and leaned forward. "We've uncovered financial irregularities in the HOA's annual reports. Funds supposedly allocated for infrastructure and community maintenance have been diverted into personal accounts. This goes back over a decade." I raised an eyebrow. "What does that have to do with my land?" "Here's where it gets interesting," Monroe said. "Your cabin was never part of the HOA, but Helen Langford tried to annex it anyway. That move was more than a power grab. Turns out, your parcel was listed as collateral in a private loan agreement the HOA entered into 6 months ago. They used fake maps to inflate their holdings and secure a loan for nearly $300,000. My stomach dropped. "They used my property without my knowledge as security for a loan," Monroe nodded. "That's bank fraud, and it gets worse." When we pulled the HOA's internal emails, we found a thread between Helen and the treasurer. They were planning to default on the loan, liquidate the HOA's remaining assets, and disappear before the lien hit. "Your property was going to be one of the first seized illegally." I stood up from the table. "So this wasn't just about dues or boundaries, this was a setup." Exactly. And because your case triggered the investigation, the fraud unit at the state level is expanding their scope. We've got subpoenas going out to every board member. 2 of them have already turned over ledgers and private accounts. I stared at the floorboards, barely hearing the creak of the wood beneath me. The land my grandfather left me had nearly been stolen not just by lies, but by a scheme designed to collapse and leave others holding the bag. "I've got something to show you," I said, walking over to the cabinet near the back wall. I pulled out a metal box and set it on the table. Inside were photocopies of every document I'd collected since I started restoring the cabin: historic zoning maps, utility records, and a notarized letter from the title company confirming boundary lines. I handed Monroe a folder. "I made 3 copies. Sent one to my attorney, kept one here, and this is for you." He flipped through the pages, nodding as he read. "This is solid, reinforces the case, we'll add it to the affidavit." When he left, the light outside had faded into a deep orange. I watched his taillights vanish beyond the bend, then stepped back inside and locked the door. The next morning, Claire called with an update. She was already drafting a motion to bar the HOA from filing any further legal claims against me. But she'd also heard something new: Helen was missing. She didn't show up to her scheduled interview with the state fraud unit, Claire said. Her phone's off, and her Lexus was found in the parking garage of a hotel 2 counties over. Room was empty, no check-in under her name. "They're treating her as a fugitive now." I leaned against the kitchen sink. "She ran. Looks like it." But here's the kicker: the HOA's treasurer admitted Helen had a second identity, old voter records, fake address, the works. They think she's done this before. Same scam, possibly. The fraud unit is combing through other associations she's been involved with. One in Tennessee, another in Oregon. Both dissolved under suspicious financial circumstances. So Pinebrook Meadows wasn't her first target, it was just the one where she finally got caught. Later that week, the state's forensic accountants released a preliminary report. Over $400,000 had been siphoned from the HOA's reserve fund over the years. Some of it was funneled through fake landscaping companies, others through inflated repair contracts. Most damning of all, a series of wire transfers traced directly to a shell corporation Helen owned under an alias. Detective Monroe called me again. "We just got confirmation from the banking commission. The loans taken out against your property were done using forged documents. Your name and signature were digitally added to the deed paperwork, but the original files show no such authorization. We're issuing a formal fraud charge tied to identity theft." I sat on the porch steps for a long time after the call ended. The land around me was quiet, but it no longer felt like just a patch of forest. It felt like a crime scene that hadn't known it was one. A week later, the state attorney general held a press conference. Cameras flashed as she listed the charges against the entire Pinebrook Meadows board. Grand larceny, forgery, wire fraud, racketeering. Claire sent me a recording. The most surreal moment came when the AG held up a blown-up photo of the forged annexation map and pointed to the creek. "This natural boundary was ignored because greed doesn't respect geography," she said. But the law does. By the end of the month, the HOA was officially dissolved by court order. Residents would vote on forming a voluntary civic association with no enforcement power, no dues, and no board. Several of them reached out to thank me, people I'd never met. One man, a retired firefighter named Saul, drove up to the cabin to shake my hand. "I've lived in Pinebrook 20 years, he said. "Watched Helen run it like a kingdom. No one thought we could fight her. Then you did," I nodded. "I just didn't want to lose what my grandfather left me." "Well, you saved more than that," he said. "You saved the whole neighborhood." Claire filed a civil suit on my behalf against the HOA's remaining assets to compensate for the stress, legal costs, and attempted seizure. The court awarded me a settlement, small compared to what was stolen, but enough to finish restoring the entire property. I used some of the money to rebuild the old shed out back, this time with reinforced steel framing and a proper foundation. I had a feeling I'd need space for the documents and footage I'd collected, lessons and proof for any future battles. One afternoon, as I was stacking lumber, a drone buzzed overhead. I followed it with my eyes until it hovered and turned back the way it came. That night, I installed a signal jammer and picked up a trail camera that captured a blurry image of someone in a windbreaker crouching near the edge of the creek. The authorities never caught Helen, but they froze her accounts, flagged her passport, and notified federal agencies. If she ever surfaced, she'd face charges across multiple jurisdictions. As for me, I didn't leave. I built a tall cedar fence not to keep others out, but to mark the boundary that no one could cross again. And I kept the cabin lights on every night, a quiet signal that the land was watched, protected, and no longer in the shadows. Because sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about holding on to what's yours, it's about making sure no one else ever has to fight the same battle alone. 2 weeks after the state attorney general's press conference, the area surrounding what used to be Pinebrook Meadows was so quiet, it felt like nature was reclaiming the land. No more patrols from self-appointed HOA enforcers. No more threats taped to mailboxes. It was as if the whole neighborhood had taken a deep breath and decided to remember what life felt like without someone constantly looking over their shoulder. I kept to myself mostly. After everything, people respected the boundary lines, literal and otherwise. But one morning I got a call from Claire. She didn't usually sound rattled, but that day she didn't even say hello. "They found something," she said. She was already waiting in her car when I arrived at the old HOA clubhouse. It had been padlocked by the county weeks earlier, but now crime scene tape flapped across the front porch. 2 marked vehicles were parked along the curb, and a plain gray van sat idling by the curb with its doors open and an evidence tech hunched inside. Claire stepped out and met me near the sidewalk. "They cracked into the hard drive from Helen's old office computer," she said. "Turns out there was a hidden folder, encrypted. Took the state IT team 5 days to access it." I stared at her. "What was in it?" she exhaled through her nose. "Photos, dozens of individual yards, homes, cars, people, all dated and tagged. Some of them were taken at night." I tried to process that. Surveillance? Worse. She had a file on every resident who'd ever disagreed with her, notes about their schedules, property lines. Even copies of their utility bills and applications for permits. She was tracking them like suspects. I didn't think it could get any darker than fraud. Claire didn't respond. "Who else knows about this?" I asked, Detective Monroe, "and now the FBI." "Because it doesn't stop with Pinebrook." I followed her past the tape and into the clubhouse. The place was dusty, with signs of a rushed exit, drawers left open, a lamp knocked over, a stack of papers scattered across the floor. At the back, one of the evidence techs was photographing a corkboard. When I leaned in, I saw why. There were maps, not just of Pinebrook. At least 4 other neighborhood diagrams pinned side by side, each one marked with little red pins and dates, names written in block letters. It was a web, and Helen Langford was at the center of it. "She used Pinebrook as a pilot," Claire said, "then moved on. Each community had a similar pattern. She'd show up under a different name, get on the board, then start rewriting the rules from the inside." I stared at the board. "Have they found the others?" "They've located 2, one in New Mexico, another in Virginia. Both had sudden HOA collapses with large missing funds and no prosecution. But now that her real name's out, they're reopening those cases." I turned to her. "What happens to the residents she targeted? We're giving them everything." "The files, the surveillance records, it's all being cataloged for a civil rights complaint. This might turn into a class action." I ran a hand through my hair and looked around the empty clubhouse. She tried to turn a neighborhood into a trap. She almost succeeded. That evening, I drove back to the cabin and stood on the porch for a long time. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. I could hear the creek in the distance, steady and calm. The next week, Detective Monroe called again. "We got a hit," he said. Border Patrol flagged Helen's alias at a small private airport near the Texas line. She used a third-party charter under a false name, but one of the agents recognized her from the alert. "She's in custody." I let the silence hang a moment. What charges? Federal fraud, identity theft, interstate financial crimes, surveillance without consent. She's facing over 20 years. I didn't ask what her plea was. I didn't care. The trial was scheduled for the fall. I drove down to the courthouse with Claire and sat in the gallery as the charges were read. Helen didn't look at anyone. Her hair was dyed dark, her posture stiff. She didn't speak during the arraignment. The prosecutor laid it all out. Forged documents, manipulated elections, embezzlement, data theft, surveillance of private citizens, and fraudulent annexation of parcels across state lines. The judge denied bail. The courtroom clapped, not loud but enough to feel like a release. After the hearing, Claire and I filed a final motion on my behalf, an order permanently severing any legal tie between my land and any organized residential covenant. It was approved the same afternoon. A month later, the Pinebrook residents held their first truly independent neighborhood meeting. No agenda, just folding chairs in someone's backyard, lemonade, and people who finally felt free to talk openly. They invited me, and I went not to speak, just to listen. Saul, the retired firefighter, stood up at one point. "We let this happen because we thought we couldn't stop it," he said. "But then someone did. And now we get to decide what kind of place we want to be." I didn't need applause. I didn't need credit. I just nodded and watched as people passed around a sign-up sheet for a volunteer garden cleanup instead of a fine collection list. Back at the cabin, I found an envelope waiting on the porch. No return address. Inside was a single photo of my grandfather standing in front of the original cabin, hammer in hand, the same slope and creek behind him. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Protect what you build." I never figured out who left it. Maybe someone from town, maybe an old friend, but it didn't matter. I framed it and hung it on the wall above the fireplace. Later that fall, I finished restoring the last room of the cabin, the old study. I built shelves out of pine and filled them with every document, every map, every letter connected to what had happened. Not because I wanted to relive it, but because I wanted it to be remembered. People still reach out. A couple from Arizona who read about the case in a legal journal. A city councilman from upstate who wants to introduce new legislation limiting HOA powers. A former board member from one of Helen's earlier communities who finally has the courage to speak up. The cabin has become more than a home. It's a line in the sand. A reminder that even the quietest places need someone willing to stand and say, "No further." I still walk the creek every morning, still split wood out back. Still hear the wind through the pines just like I did when I was 10 years old, following my grandfather through the brush, learning how to listen. But now I carry something else with me, not fear, not anger, resolve. Because when someone tries to steal what's yours with a clipboard and a smile, you don't just stop them. You make sure they never do it again.